The ballroom of
Don't
the
worry,
Ivory Crown
everything will
Hotel
be
was
all
dressed
right.
in gold
Are you
and
sure?
white.
I feel so
The
uneasy.
kind of
promise.
setting that made
Trust me.
people stand a little
I
straighter
have to tell you
and speak
something.
a little louder.
Oh, really? What is it?
As though the
I think I
expensive
know.
surroundings demanded a
should be good.
performance from everyone inside
What are you
them.
doing here?
Crystal
I was
glasses
invited. Is
caught
that
the
a problem?
chandelier light and
Gentlemen,
threw tiny
please,
rainbows
not
across
here.
the
We'll see.
tablecloths.
Listen to me very
Waiters moved
carefully.
silently.
What's
between
happening? You're
clusters
scaring
of
me.
guests,
We have to
offering
leave.
champagne
Now.
and small plates of food.
Don't
that
worry,
looked beautiful,
everything will be all
tasted
right.
like very
Are you
little.
sure? I feel
It
so
was
uneasy.
exactly the
I
sort
promise.
of event that
Trust me.
Sophia Reyes had
I
described
have
to
to
her
tell you
husband a dozen
something.
times
Oh,
over
really?
the past
What is
3
it?
weeks.
I think I know.
Always with the same
should be
nervous
good.
excitement in her voice.
What are you doing here?
Always ending
I
with
was
the same
invited. Is
quiet
that a
hope
problem?
that maybe this year
Gentlemen,
something
please,
good would
not
finally
here.
happen
We'll
for
see.
her at Meridian PR.
Listen to me very carefully.
Sophia
What's happening? You're scaring me.
stood near the
We have to
entrance in a
leave.
deep burgundy
Now.
dress. Her dark curls pinned back, watching the room fill with people she had worked alongside for 4 years. She was one of the best designers on staff, and she knew it. Not from arrogance, but from the results she produced quarter after quarter. The campaigns that won awards, the clients who requested her by name, the late nights she gave to a company that rarely gave anything back. She had learned to be patient. She had learned to be professional. She had also learned to watch her back whenever Randolph Hale was in the room. Elliot arrived at 7:20, just as Sophia had begun to wonder if he had gotten lost in the parking garage. He appeared in the doorway wearing a clean navy blazer over a white shirt, no tie, dark trousers that were pressed but plain. He looked like a man who had chosen comfort over impression, which was exactly who he was, at least on the surface. Sophia felt a rush of warmth when she saw him and walked quickly to meet him before anyone else could form an opinion. "You made it," she said, squeezing his hand. He smiled at her. That quiet, steady smile she had fallen in love with 8 years ago in a coffee shop in Denver, where he had been sitting alone with a paperback and she had spilled her entire drink across his table. He had just handed her napkins and asked her name. That was Elliot. No drama. No performance. "You look beautiful," he said, and he meant it the way. Only someone truly paying attention can mean something. She looped her arm through his and guided him into the room. Pointing out the ice sculpture near the bar and the photo display on the far wall celebrating the firm's 20th anniversary, she was proud of several of those campaign images. 2 of them were her designs. She did not point that out. They had barely reached the bar when Jenny Caldwell appeared, bright-eyed and genuinely glad to see them both. Jenny was one of those rare people who made an office survivable. She worked in client relations and had a talent for reading rooms and remembering birthdays and saying exactly the right thing when everything felt wrong. She hugged Sophia and shook Elliot's hand with real warmth. "It is so good to finally meet you in person," Jenny said. "Sophia talks about you constantly. Only the good things, I hope," Elliot replied. "All of them," Jenny said, and Sophia could tell she meant it. They stood together for a few comfortable minutes before the environment shifted. Sophia felt it before she saw it. The way the energy in a room changes when a certain kind of person enters. Randolph Hale had arrived at their corner of the bar. He was a tall man in his early 50s with silver hair that he wore, swept back with precision, as though even his appearance had been approved by a board of directors. His suit was charcoal with a faint chalk stripe, and his watch caught the light every time he lifted his drink. He had the kind of face that looked permanently disappointed, even when he was smiling, which was not often unless someone important was watching. Sophia straightened instinctively. She could not help it. For years of working under Randolph had trained her body to brace whenever he approached. He looked at Jenny first, gave a small nod, then turned to Sophia. He did not acknowledge Elliot at all, which was itself a message. Randolph was precise with his silences. "Sophia," he said, "glad you could make the event." He glanced at her dress briefly. Festive choice? It was not a compliment. It was dressed up as one, which was how Randolph operated. He had a gift for wrapping cruelty in the language of observation, so that if you objected, you looked sensitive, and if you stayed silent, you looked compliant. "This is my husband," Elliot Sophia said, her voice perfectly level. Randolph turned to Elliot then, slow and deliberate. The way someone looks at an object they are deciding whether to acknowledge. He extended his hand. Elliot took it and shook it once firmly. "Randolph," Elliot said pleasantly, Something flickered across Randolph's face. He had not offered his first name. Elliot had simply used it naturally, and without apology. And that small act of ease had registered somewhere behind Randolph's eyes. "I was not aware spouses were attending tonight," Randolph said, looking back at Sophia. "The invitation was for company members and their partners." "Of course, but I had expected most people to come professionally prepared." He paused, just long enough. Both of them. Sophia felt her jaw tighten. Jenny looked away toward the ice sculpture. Elliot took a small sip of his water. He did not drink alcohol at events, and he had told the bartender quietly when they arrived. He looked entirely unburied. "It is a beautiful venue," Elliot said to Randolph, as though the man had said nothing pointed at all. "You must have had a hand in choosing it." This kind of attention to detail usually comes from someone who cares about appearances. Randolph looked at him for a moment, uncertain whether he was being complimented or something else. "I leave the event planning to the operations team," he said finally. "Pity," Elliot replied. "They did a wonderful job." He turned to Sophia, then, and asked her if she wanted to look at the photo display before dinner was called. And she took his arm and walked with him away from the bar. And she could feel Randolph watching them go with the expression of a man who had thrown a ball and somehow ended up hitting himself. Sophia exhaled when they were out of earshot. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he asked. "For not letting him make it weird." He looked at her sideways. "He made it weird. I just did not participate." She laughed, despite herself, a real laugh, the tension breaking at the edges. They stopped in front of the photo wall, and she found her campaign for the Hollis Foundation near the center. A series of warm images about community rebuilding that had won a regional communications award 18 months ago. Her name was not printed on the wall next to it. Randolph's was. She had noticed that when the display went up 2 days ago, she had not said anything. That was also something she had learned to do, notice and say nothing. Carry the weight quietly and keep moving. Elliot looked at the image for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "That one is yours," he said. It was not a question. She nodded. He looked back at it, the warmth in the photographs, the care in the composition, the quiet dignity of every image. Then he looked at the name printed beside it. He said nothing further, but something in his expression had changed, like a man filing something carefully away. Dinner was announced a few minutes later, and they made their way to their assigned seats. Their table was near the back of the room, tucked beside a pillar, the kind of placement that communicated clearly where someone stood in the company hierarchy. Jenny was at the same table, along with 2 other junior staff members and a client services coordinator named Greg, who seemed genuinely delighted about the salmon. From across the room, Randolph sat at the front table with the partners and senior directors. Already holding court, Sophia watched him for a moment, then turned back to her husband, who was asking Greg about the salmon. She was glad Elliot was there. She did not yet know how glad she was going to be. The evening had barely begun. The dinner moved through its courses with the polished efficiency of an expensive catering company that had done this exact thing hundreds of times before. Soup arrived and was cleared. Bread baskets appeared and disappeared. Conversations rose and fell around the room like tides, some genuine and some performed. And Sophia found herself relaxing in small degrees as the evening settled. Into a rhythm she could manage. Elliot was good at dinners. He always had been. He could talk to anyone without ever seeming like he was trying, which Sophia had always found remarkable because she knew from years of watching him that he was, in fact, paying very close attention to everything being said. He had a way of asking questions that made people feel interesting, and people who felt interesting tended to open up in ways they had not planned to, by the middle of the main course. Greg had told Elliot his entire career history and seemed deeply satisfied about it. Jenny had covered her experience at 3 previous firms before landing at Meridian. Even the quieter staff members had gradually joined the conversation. Drawn in by Elliot's easy manner and genuine attention, Sophia watched him from beside her salmon and felt the familiar pull of pride and mystery that had lived in her chest since the early days of their marriage. She knew her husband was not what he appeared to be at first glance. She knew that the simple blazer and the unhurried manner and the complete absence of any need to impress anyone were not signs of a man without ambition. They were signs of a man who had nothing to prove. She also knew, in the way that married people know things without being told, that tonight was not a coincidence. She had suspected for several months that the investment deal Elliot had been working on, the one that had kept him in meetings until late in the evenings and sent him traveling twice to New York and once to Chicago, had something to do with the marketing sector. He had been careful with the details, but she knew how to read him. She had never pushed, because he had always kept his professional life separate from hers. A boundary they had agreed on early in their relationship so that her career could stand entirely on its own terms and never be tangled with his resources or his name. She had respected that boundary. Tonight she was beginning to understand why he might have chosen to cross it. Across the room, Randolph had finished his dinner and was now moving between tables the way powerful people do at company events, stopping briefly at each one to dispense a few words and collect whatever small piece of validation the interaction offered him. He worked the room from the front to the back, and Sophia tracked his progress with the instinct of someone who had learned to know where he was at all times. He arrived at their table when the dessert plates were being set down, and he arrived with energy that was different from the bar encounter earlier. He had been drinking steadily through dinner, and there was a looseness to his edges now, a slight expansion of whatever impulse usually stayed. Contained behind his professional manner, he stood at the corner of the table and looked around at its occupants with an expression that managed to be both inclusive and condescending at the same time. Everyone enjoying themselves back here? He asked, in the tone of a man checking on staff in a break room. Very much, Jenny said. Pleasantly. Good food, Greg offered. Randolph's gaze landed on Elliot. He studied him for a moment with the particular focus of someone returning to an unfinished thought. I did not catch what you do for work, he said to Elliot. Earlier at the bar? Investments, Elliot said simply. Randolph raised his eyebrows slightly. What kind of investments? Various kinds, Elliot replied. Randolph smiled in a way that was not a smile. He looked at the table briefly, then back up. Various kinds. He repeated the phrase slowly, as though testing its weight and finding it insufficient. He looked at Sophia. You must be very supportive of him, exploring various kinds of things. It takes patience, living with someone still. Figuring out their direction, the table went quiet in the specific way that tables go quiet when something ugly has been said, and everyone present knows it, but nobody is certain what to do with it. Sophia set down her dessert fork. Elliot is not figuring out his direction, she said. He has been running his own firm for 11 years. Randolph tilted his head with theatrical interest. A firm? Is that what we are calling it? Very entrepreneurial. He looked back at Elliot with an expression of performed respect that insulted more than open contempt would have. I admire people who pursue passion projects. It takes courage to commit to something, even without conventional success. He paused. Sophia works very hard to build her career here. We are all very proud of what she has achieved. Given everything, Sophia repeated quietly. What does that mean? Randolph spread his hands in a gesture of false innocence. Only that building a career at a firm like ours requires total dedication. And that can be difficult when home responsibilities are unbalanced. He glanced at Elliot once more. No offense intended. None was going to be taken, Elliot said calmly. And there was something in the way he said it that made Randolph pause for just a fraction of a second before he recovered his smile. Well then, Randolph said, tapping the back of an empty chair twice. Enjoy your dessert. The announcements begin shortly. I imagine it will be quite a memorable evening. He walked away toward the front of the room, stopping briefly to exchange words with the CFO 2 tables over. Jenny watched him go and then exhaled through her nose. He gets worse every year, she said quietly. Sophia said nothing. She was pressing her fingertip against the tablecloth in small circles, a habit she had when she was controlling something she did not want to show. Elliot reached over and rested his hand gently on hers. She looked at him. How long? He said softly. Not loudly enough for the table to hear. She understood what he was asking. She had understood it the moment he asked it. Since my second year, she said. It was minor at first. Little comments, taking credit quietly. Then it got more deliberate. She paused. He blocked my promotion last spring. Told Patricia I needed another cycle to develop leadership readiness. Jenny found out because she was in the room when he said it. Jenny looked at the tablecloth. He said that about you. Elliot said. He says versions of it about anyone who gets too close to outperforming him, Jenny said, keeping her voice low. There have been complaints. At least that is what people say. But nothing ever happens because he brings in big client. Relationships and the partners protect revenue over everything else. Elliot nodded slowly. He picked up his water glass and looked across the room, toward the front table where Randolph was now laughing at something the CFO had said, his head thrown back with easy confidence. Sophia watched her husband's face. She had seen that expression before, not often, but enough times to recognize it. It was not anger. It was something quieter and more deliberate than anger. It was the face he wore when he had made a decision. His phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen, read something briefly, and turned it face down. A few minutes later, the lights in the ballroom softened, and a single spotlight illuminated the small stage at the front of the room. Patricia Owens walked out to the microphone with the easy authority of a woman who had built something from nothing and knew exactly what that was worth. She was in her early 60s, silver-haired, dressed in a deep navy suit that made no apologies for itself. The room settled immediately. Patricia had that effect on people. Thank you all for being here tonight, she began. 20 years ago, I started this company with 4 clients, 2 employees, and an office that was genuinely the size of a large closet. Tonight, we are celebrating what can happen when talented people commit to doing excellent work over a long period of time. Applause moved through the room. But tonight is not only about looking backward, Patricia continued. We have spent the past 18 months in serious conversation with a strategic investment partner, someone who has studied this industry carefully and believes in what we are building. The agreement we have reached will allow us to expand into 4 new markets, invest in our creative departments, and build the kind of infrastructure that lets talented people do their best work without limits. The energy in the room had shifted into the sharp alertness of people who understood that something significant was being said and that it was going to affect their lives. Directly, Sophia felt her heart rate rise. This was the announcement. This was what everyone had been speculating about for weeks. Patricia smiled. She looked toward the back of the room. I would like to introduce the principal investor behind Cascade Capital Partners. He has been involved in due diligence for this partnership for the better part of a year, and tonight he has graciously agreed to join us for the formal announcement. Sophia turned to look at her husband. His chair was empty. She looked toward the stage. Elliot was walking between the tables, his navy blazer catching the spotlight as he made his way calmly and unhurriedly toward the front of the room. And Sophia pressed both hands flat against the tablecloth and breathed through her nose and felt something enormous and complicated move through her chest all at once. Jenny made a sound beside her that was somewhere between a gasp and a laugh. The room was watching him walk forward, with the confused attention of people trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they thought they already knew. Whispers moved between tables like small fires catching. Randolph had gone completely still at the front table. His champagne glass was raised halfway to his mouth, and it stayed there. Elliot climbed the 2 steps to the stage, shook Patricia's hand, and turned to face the room. Good evening, he said into the microphone. His voice was the same voice Sophia had heard say good morning across the breakfast table for 8 years. Steady and warm and entirely uninterested in performance. Owe several of you a proper introduction. The silence that had settled over the ballroom of the Ivory Crown Hotel was the kind that has texture and weight to it, the kind that people remember long after the words that caused it have faded. Every face in the room was turned toward the stage where Elliot Vaughn stood under the spotlight in his plain navy blazer. And the contrast between what they were seeing and what they had assumed about him all evening was doing visible work behind their eyes. He looked out at the room. Without theater, without any of the practiced authority that men like Randolph performed so consistently, he simply stood there, comfortable in himself, and waited for the quiet to settle completely before he spoke again. "My name is Elliot Vaughn," he said. "I am the founder and managing partner of Cascade Capital Partners. We are a private investment firm focused on communications, media, and creative industries. We have been operating for 11 years, and we currently manage a portfolio valued at just over $2.4 billion. He said the number the way someone might mention the weather. Not casually, exactly, but without inflation, as though it was simply a fact and facts did not require decoration. At the front table, Randolph Hale had set his champagne glass down. His face had the particular quality of a man whose internal system was processing something it had not been built to handle. "I spent the past 18 months evaluating Meridian PR as a potential partner," Elliot continued. "In that time, I reviewed your financial statements, your client retention data, your creative output metrics, and your competitive positioning. The numbers are excellent. The creative work is genuinely outstanding. Several campaigns produced by this firm in the last 3 years represent the best work in your sector nationally." Patricia stood to the side of the stage with her hands folded, watching him with an expression that Sophia recognized from the 3 times she had been in the room when Patricia was deciding whether to trust someone. "Fully, but Elliot was not finished. We also conduct what we call a culture assessment as part of every major due diligence process," he said. "This is not standard practice in the investment world. We began doing it 8 years ago after we watched a company with extraordinary fundamentals collapse from the inside over a period of 18 months because its leadership culture had been allowed to rot quietly beneath the surface. We lost a significant amount of money in that situation. More importantly, roughly 200 people lost jobs they had worked hard for through no fault of their own." He paused. "So now we look at culture. We interview employees anonymously. We review HR records through proper legal channels. We survey former staff. We assess management behavior patterns over time." He looked across the room steadily. "What we found at Meridian was mostly exceptional. The creative teams here are some of the most motivated and genuinely talented professionals I have encountered in this industry. The client services staff show levels of dedication that are above sector average by a measurable margin. The company Patricia has built is worth investing in." He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and removed a folded document. He did not unfold it yet. "However," he said, "our assessment also identified a significant and sustained pattern of toxic management behavior originating from one member of senior leadership. A pattern that has been documented internally through 14 formal HR complaints filed over a 3-year period. A pattern that has resulted in the departure of at least 9 high-performing employees who cited hostile management as their primary reason for leaving." He looked at the document in his hand. "A pattern whose financial cost to this company, calculated in lost productivity, recruitment expenses, training costs, and missed revenue from departed client relationships, amounts to approximately $1.8 million over those same 3 years." He looked up from the document and directly at Randolph Hale. Randolph did not move. He looked like a man who had been turned to stone mid-breath. "I want to be clear about something," Elliot said, and his voice was as even and unhurried as it had been at the beginning. "What happened tonight was not the reason I am raising this. What happened tonight was one evening. What I have documented covers 3 years. The investment agreement Cascade Capital has signed with Meridian includes a mandatory leadership accountability clause. This is standard in all our agreements. It requires the implementation of independent management assessments, protected employee feedback channels, and enforceable standards of professional conduct at every level of the organization." He refolded the document and placed it back in his pocket. "Patricia, I know this is not how you expected this evening to go." He looked at her directly. "But I also know you did not build this company over 20 years by avoiding hard conversations. What you do with this information is ultimately your decision. What I can tell you is that the people working in this building deserve leadership that reflects the quality of the work they produce." Patricia held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, with the composure of a woman absorbing something difficult and deciding, in real time, to let it change her. She stepped back to the microphone. She looked out at the room. The silence remained, but its quality had shifted. It was no longer stunned. It was waiting, Randolph, Patricia said. And her voice carried everything a last name carries when it is spoken in that particular tone. You are suspended, effective immediately, pending a full internal review. You will receive formal communication from HR by 9 tomorrow morning. Please collect your things and leave the event. Randolph stood. His chair scraped back loudly in the quiet. His face had passed through several colors and had arrived at something pale and fixed. This is completely, began Randolph, Patricia said again. That was all. He looked around the room. He looked at the partners. He looked at the CFO. He looked at Dean Foster, his assistant director, who was examining the tablecloth with great focus. One by one, every face he turned to found somewhere else to be. The room had made its calculation and arrived at its answer before he had finished. Looking, he picked up his phone from the table. He straightened his jacket with the automatic gesture of a man whose body still remembered how to perform dignity, even when the situation no longer supported it. He walked toward the exit without looking at Elliot, and without looking at Sophia, and without looking at anyone who might look back at him. The doors closed and the room exhaled. Patricia turned back to her guests. She began to speak about the investment agreement and what it meant for the firm going forward, about expansion and resources and the future she intended to build. People began to listen again, first tentatively and then with genuine attention, as the energy in the room found a new shape to settle into. Sophia had not moved from her seat at the back table. Jenny was sitting beside her with both hands wrapped around her water glass, not drinking, just holding it. Greg was very still. The other two staff members at the table were watching the stage with expressions that cycled slowly between disbelief and something that looked very much like relief. Sophia stood when Elliot came down from the stage. She walked toward him through the tables, and people stepped aside without seeming to notice they were doing it. And she stopped in front of him and looked at him for a long moment before she said anything. 18 months. She said. He nodded. You never said a word. We agreed to keep things separate. She shook her head slowly. That was not what I meant. She pressed her fingers briefly against her eyes, careful of her makeup, then lowered her hands and looked at him directly. I mean, you sat at that table tonight and let him say every single one of those things to you, and you never once defended yourself. I did not need to. He said, you could have stopped it earlier. Yes. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. Because I needed to see it clearly. Not through your description of it or Jenny's account or an HR document. I needed to see how he behaved when he thought the audience was no one. She breathed out slowly, and he is worse in person, Elliot said, which I did not think was possible based on what I had already read. She laughed. It came out unsteady, but genuine. And she pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder, and he put one hand on her back, and they stood like that. For a moment, in the slowly warming noise of the recovering room around them, Patricia appeared beside them. She looked at Sophia with the direct attention she usually reserved for partners' meetings. I owe you an apology. Not a general one. A specific one.
Sophia straightened. Your promotion review last spring, Patricia said. I accepted information about your leadership readiness from a single source without seeking additional assessment. That was a failure of my judgment and I intend to correct it. She paused. The creative director position is being restructured as part of our expansion. I would like you to be part of the conversation about what that role looks like. Sophia looked at her for a moment. Then she said, I would like that very much. Patricia gave her a brief nod and turned to Elliot. Your due diligence report was the most thorough document I have received in 20 years of running this business. It was also the most uncomfortable. That tends to mean it is accurate, Elliot said. Patricia looked at him with something close to a smile. Your wife is exceptional. I suspect you already know that. Every day, he said. Patricia returned to her guests and Sophia and Elliot walked back toward their table where Jenny was on her feet waiting with her arms already open. She hugged Sophia hard and then stepped back and looked at them both with bright eyes. "I have worked here for 6 years," Jenny said. 6 years of watching him do this to people. She shook her head. "I did not think I would ever see tonight happen." Sophia squeezed her hand. "Neither did I." The gala continued around them, looser now and warmer, people moving between tables with less performance and more ease. The expansion announcement was already being discussed in clusters of genuine excitement. Names were being mentioned for new roles. Possibilities were circulating that had not existed an hour ago. At some point near the end of the evening, Elliot and Sophia stepped out through the side doors onto the hotel terrace. The night air was cool and they stood together at the railing looking out over the city lights below. He took her hand. "I want to ask you something," she said. He waited. "That first night you came to my office holiday party. 4 years ago when I had just started at Meridian." She looked at him. "You had already started the due diligence process by then, hadn't you?" He smiled at the city lights. "I had started looking at several firms in the sector, yes. And Meridian was on the list. It came onto the list about 3 months after you joined it," he said. He looked at her then. "Your work was part of what drew our attention. The Hollis Foundation campaign. It was in an industry report we were reviewing. Our analyst flagged it and I looked it up and I recognized the sensibility behind it immediately." He paused. "I had been married to that sensibility for 4 years by then. I knew what it looked like." She stared at him. "You identified my company partly because of my work." "I identified your company because the creative output was exceptional," he said. "Your work was the clearest example of why." She turned back to the city lights. They were quiet for a while. "Your name should have been on that wall," he said. She nodded. "It will be," he said. "Not because of me. Because it was always yours." She leaned her head against his shoulder and they stood there while the city moved below them, and inside the ballroom behind them the room that had been tense and sharp-edged an hour ago was slowly becoming something else entirely. She had walked into this building tonight braced for another evening of swallowing what she deserved. She was leaving it with something she had almost stopped believing in. Not because her husband was wealthy. Not because he had power. Because he had been paying attention the whole time. And sometimes that is the thing that changes everything.